This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and the issue of tenants and millions of tenants now who face dire situations of eviction, living in tents, their lives being destroyed, them and their families and their children, is upmost in the minds of people in the United States who are trying to pay their rent and trying to survive. And joining us today is Mimi Rosenberg. She is a lawyer with Legal Aid in Brooklyn Neighborhood Office. She's also one of the co-producers of WBAI's Building Bridges, a labor show which is distributed nationally. And she's also a member of UAW 2325, the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys. So welcome to WorkWeek, Mimi.
It's entirely my pleasure to be here.
So Mimi, first of all, New York has a special presence in the election because Trump, the president, was involved in New York as far as tenants and public housing. Why don't you talk about, what's been going on in New York with public housing and the role of Trump?
Well, first of all, let me just contextualize any discussion of housing. I mean, it has to be understood as to we live in a society which is unconscionable, that does not see the need for shelter as a human right. Indeed, what it sees it as a mode of profitability, and in New York, it's certainly one of the leading industries, along with the FICA industry. It's the finance, capital, and real estate is what builds wealth, and it certainly did for Trump and Trump's father, which is really where he got the wealth, and that is by capitalizing on people's fundamental need that the government should be providing for housing. That's just one thing that absolutely has to be said. Until we actually have a government and install in the laws the human right to shelter and remove the issue of profitability, we're going to have a system that is just egregious in terms of what it portends for the working class, for impoverished people, and being able to have the basic substance and essentials of human life. I also want to say that housing has to be understood in another context historically, and that's a mechanism of control. It's been a mechanism of control since slavery. If you can control where people live and the services they get there, you have complete control of their lives. And we have long sought to live in a segregated society to control the population, both for political reasons as well as for economic reasons. And the situation is now being exacerbated, of course, by the reality of COVID. And where does COVID come from, and how does it, and who does it affect? It affects most specifically people who are poor. And who are the people that are the most poor? It is people of African ancestry, it is the brown people, it is the immigrant people, etc. So anything that happens with housing has to be seen in that political context. And in New York, specifically now, we already have a population of at least 92,000 people who are homeless, 54,000 who are homeless families. The other are generally singles who are in the congregate shelter system or in temporary hotels and motels and the like. So we are in a city where its predominant form of revenue comes from the real estate industry. And that has everything to do with the policies and practices that have inured to, before the pandemic, the growth and reality and stimulation of homelessness. And what I mean by that is it has to be understood, and we'll get to COVID, et cetera. But it is, of course, the Trumps of the world, but it is the government that sets the policies and acts as the handmaidens for the Trumps of the world, who are realtors and made their money essentially such as it is from realty. It is the government policy that has facilitated that. So in New York, before the pandemic, the 92,000 that we're speaking to, the 54,000 homeless families, are a result of what? The rents are too damn high. Of course the rents are too damn high. Why are they too damn high? Because the industry has long sought upzoning. What does upzoning do? It seeks to create housing in whatever the land base is that is more lucrative for the developers. And in New York, we have had a housing boom, and we've had a mayor, a succession of mayors who have upzoned various neighborhoods to grab the land, neighborhoods that were essentially poor and working class. And what happens then? Well, it's a classic form of gentrification, i.e., what do? It's when you are set your sights on gentrifying a neighborhood, which means is extracting more wealth from the housing out of a group of people who can afford to pay more. You have to get the housing back. You have to get the housing stock. The housing stock is invariably in marginalized neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods, in working class neighborhoods. Land base is limited. So we have upzoning in poor residential neighborhoods that are, of course, creating massive speculation towards the end of major gentrification, which invariably means the dislocation of the populations that are already placed there, and in effect build those neighborhoods. And the vulnerable groups are the Blacks, the brown people, most strategically in New York. So the reality is, just to say that, where do we get the 92,000 homeless people to begin with? Where do we get the 54,000 homeless? And of course, on a national level, there's upwards of maybe 40 million people that are in jeopardy of becoming homeless. The fact is that it is the gentrification process that set in motion the removal of people from their homes and their neighborhoods to bring in a wealthier base. And that has everything to do, as you well know, Steve, particularly given the work that you do, with what's happening in the labor force. And at this juncture in the labor force, with robotization and et cetera, there is much less inclination for the workers that are in essentially low-paid service jobs. And as they are less desirable, what their housing and their housing stock in their neighborhoods become the source of wealth and profitability. Housing has to be understood as, first and foremost, a system of profitability that is unforgivably based on the essential need that the human species has for shelter. And if that's not a perversion and an inherent cruelty, I don't know what is. So I think that no matter what, the demands, and then we can get to the specifics in New York and so on, but the demands have to be, for any progressive movement and any progressive group of people, that there be the right to shelter. And I indeed believe that shelter has to be shelter in the public domain. And what I mean by that, that government, first and foremost, has the mandate, morally and politically, to provide shelter for its populace. And that shelter cannot, must not, should not be used as a source of income and profitability for the corporatocracy. So,
and we're speaking with
that,
Mimi Rosenberg.
so we were hurting desperately, and losing our housing stock and losing our population, and in New York becoming a hyper-segregated city with the zoning processes that were taking back neighborhoods from poor people, upzoning them, giving them to speculative developers who wanted them for the gentry, where they can get higher rates of income for their units. And that led to the not only individual homelessness, but it leads to mass dislocation. Most specifically, it happened in Manhattan first, And when the land base dried up, when there was no more, and people were pushed, who were dislocated from their neighborhoods in Manhattan to the outer boroughs, what has begun to happen now is that the developers have vultured in, feeding off of the neighborhoods in the outer boroughs, and thus creating a massive dislocation similarly in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, and the like. And these are, again, the issues of capital, the real estate industry, and fed by its real handmaiden, and that is the policy and practices of government. So there's of course much more to be said. We are in an exacerbated situation now, as our neighborhoods are being dislocated, as we already have a massive population of the homeless. And I'm talking about also, I've been mostly talking about the private housing stock, but since you mentioned, and I just want to build in a caveat about this, public housing, we are losing our public housing stock, which was the housing of last resort, and actually was a good housing stock and went to where I think we need to be, which is housing provided in the public domain, where you don't spend more than what people generally do, 80% of your income to be housed, but you're spending no more than 30% of whatever your income is based on for shelter. And that's the public housing formula. But of course, with the control of Ben Carson and HUD under the Trump administration, there has been no money coming into the public housing stock, which is rapidly decaying and the infrastructure collapsing. And that is first and foremost a federal responsibility. So that we are losing that stock of housing. It's terrible. It's terrible that we are. And there's also policies on the state and city level that are causing the loss of that housing for our poorest population of people. And that is through various public policies. For example, there's massive evictions that have been inured to, and are the responsibility for which are the issues of our criminal justice policies. If you are a family and you have a young person that is dragoned into the prison system, very often your whole family then will be subject, regardless of whether or not they are implicated in whatever brought the young person to incarceration, and generally they're not, but merely by having that person arrested, there is similarly policies that come out of, they came out of the Supreme Court and various other courts that allow for the eviction of the entire family as responsible for one individual being in their household who may have been arrested. So we have thrown the poor population, we have thrown the Black and brown populations to the wolves. And I think that has everything to do with whom we need in the workforce these days, or who we don't need as many of in the workforce, as well as the various other policies of profitability that what is a human right is perceived to be, housing.
And we're speaking with Mimi Rosenberg now. Mimi, New York had more public housing probably than any other city in the United States at one time. The privatization of that housing, how is that taking place? Are they transferred to private units? And also, there are now, I think, probably 40, 50,000, how many thousands of empty condos in New York from speculators? People are buying property, they're not even living in that. And what is the role of the Democratic Party? Because apparently these developers have big control of the Democratic Party in the city of New York and the governor, Cuomo. And why don't you talk about their responsibility and their actions in escalating the evictions and capitalist development of property in New York?
Well, that's certainly a large question. Let me go back to and start with public housing. Frankly, the efforts to support public housing in really no state in the country, and certainly not in New York. They haven't been advocated for generations. I mean, when's the last time you heard a local politician, much less anybody running for national office, who ran on a policy of the maintenance of housing in the public domain in terms of either creating or shoring up the public housing stock? And why is that they have no concern? Well, generally there's a contempt and there's not much concern for the poor. But aside from that, there is greater concern for the real estate industry and the desire for land to use as a way of creating now housing that can suffice to house a much more wealthy tenant base. So the other thing that needs to be said before we get back to really the public housing stock is you're absolutely right that while there are criminal justice policies that have inured to massive evictions of low-income people from public housing, as I said, I mean, just think about it. You are in a family of 4, and mom, dad, and sister, and your son, through the horrific policies that we still have in effect here, while we may not have stop and frisk, we have broken windows and other policing policies that are no different, that criminalize people at the drop of a hat for the most de minimis alleged social infringements. And you're picking up untold numbers still of African-American youth, of Latinx youth, etc., and their whole family, merely by virtue of the fact that that one person may have been brought into the criminal justice system, are subject to eviction. I mean, that's just, really? I mean, that's antithetical to the whole kind of moral structure and even conceptualization of law, which people bear individual responsibility for their acts, and you don't seek to then in a civil arena penalize people. But that's happening, and it's a big, significant problem. And it's a thoroughly racist reality as well. Now, the other thing is that our local officials, and they are predominantly Democratic, are seeking to sell off the public housing stock, and they have been successful in doing that. And it may go from anything from erecting sliver buildings that are high rent luxury units in the midst of public housing, which has tremendous implications for what happens to the populace living in the rest of the public housing units who are impoverished. And it's, a slippery slope to losing all of that housing when you've done that. They've taken the community centers, they've taken the public space there, what limited parks or playgrounds they have, and similarly sought to build housing there. So there's also a policy of destruction of public housing, which we've managed to, that is with a very active and thoughtful tenants movement. We've stemmed the tide, but we've lost considerable numbers of units in public housing. And again, that is the housing of last resort. And it's not only the housing of last resort for poor people, but it's a good housing stock that has been allowed to deteriorate and making it rife for schemes to try and demolish it, replace it with luxury units, etc. So we're losing our public housing stock, and with it the population, of course. And we have the largest public housing stock and the best in the country. The private market, the policies that inure to what has become a major homeless population emanate from the Democrats. It's as I said, the real estate industry is right in there supporting the de Blasio campaign. They have been the bucks behind most of our political people, including people like, for example, Tish James, who was a liberal-minded woman who came out of the legal aid New York, who is now our district attorney, our state attorney generals, excuse me, who was similarly supported by the real estate industry, and Mario Cuomo with his wonderful persona on COVID on TV, but whose policies also pretend complete cooperation and indebtedness to the real estate industry, who have consistently financed his campaign, etc. So our Democratic politicians have financially been beholden and been in bed for generations with the real estate industry, which is a foremost money-making mechanism in New York. And gave people like Donald Trump, who inherited his money really from his father, as we know, who was both had segregated housing, still controls incredible amounts of housing, was involved in massive housing complexes like Starrett City, which are tens of thousands of units and the like. So these are the type of people who are the realtors, and yes, they had control over and dominance over the elected officials. And for the most part, our elected officials have been Democrats. Again, I ask you on a federal level, where have you seen a word in any debate? Have you seen any positioning whatsoever on the discussion of poverty, on a real discussion of the creation of jobs, and on the discussion of the need to house what, as I said now, is looking like nationwide is upwards of at least 40 million people that could be within the next year subject to eviction. So,
and that's one of the things that Trump made light of, his relationship with Hillary Clinton. He gave contributions to her, and the Democratic Party establishment worked quite well with Trump, and his violation of discrimination laws and his whole family's history of basically taking federal money and then targeting Black, Latino tenants in a racist campaign, really to gentrify and kick them out of their homes.
Well, certainly, I mean, the Clinton administration was the one who brought us the Rent Reform and Reconstruction Act. Essentially, they were the ones who tore apart the so-called safety net. It was they who took away from us and reformed welfare as we knew it, which was a source of income for people who were particularly impoverished. They completely destroyed that system. And of course, with that, the ability to afford housing, with the inability to afford housing, the growth of exponentially the homeless population throughout the country. So the Democrats certainly, when it, very sad to say, and purported liberal Democrats such as de Blasio in New York, such as Mario Cuomo on the state level, and most definitely the Clinton administration, etc., has long been beholden to the real estate industry and has been contemptuous of and really exacerbated the problem of entrenched poverty in this country. And why are people homeless? Because they are poor. And why are they poor? Well, they're poor either because they can't get into the job market, or they wind up in the job market without any policies and practices that are going to support their rights for a guaranteed wage on one hand, or the rights and benefits that should inure to people who create all the wealth in the workplace and in this country. So the policies of the Democrats, tragically, awfully, have been thoroughly in league with the corporatocracy, with the, they are the plutocrats that have given us more poor people, longer periods of entrenched poverty, and all that inures to that, then that's where it comes from. This is not our Roosevelt's New Deal. These are not the Democrats that we have today. And sad to say, while I will certainly say that we must remove Trump from office by any means, the policies that and platform of the Democratic Party is shameful, shameful, as of course we know, as it applies to policies around tenancy, housing, education, healthcare, and the like, all the things that, and we have a labor board that I would say that some of the Biden policies around labor rights are considerably better than we've had in previous administrations, and the right to unionize. But good gracious, we've got a long way to go before there's any consideration on the part of the Democratic Party writ large, et cetera, and on our local level for enhancing the livability and the ability to live, and for human rights and justice of the working class, and with decidedly the intersectionality and the reality that the working class in New York is a majority comprised of people of color. And so the issue of white supremacy inures to the policies and practices around housing as well. And just, it has to be said that where COVID fits into this is, of course, the disparities are abundant of who has been most subject to contracting the contagion of COVID-19, and that is the Black and brown and immigrant populations, for sure. But certainly the overwhelming numbers of people that have been affected are certainly peoples of color. And that's understandable because of their living circumstances. One, they are the low-wage workers that are in the most essential jobs, from the transit jobs to the grocers to the postal workers, et cetera. And most of the janitorial staff and others in the healthcare profession. And they are certainly the people, because of their low income and poverty, have been subject to the greatest number of health problems, from diabetes and high blood pressure, et cetera, which has made them much more susceptible to the contagion. So there's the whole racism that inures to COVID and who contracts it. And so now we have scheduled just immediately, and these are numbers that I can tell you, there are roughly 200,000 cases that are in the pipeline in the housing courts that had been brought to a temporary halt as of March 17th, during the height or the beginning of the height of the pandemic in New York, and when the courts effectively closed down. So there's 200,000 cases there. Most of those cases are non-payment cases. Those cases have begun to kick into gear again now. There is no prohibition on bar moving towards evictions of those cases that were already in the pipeline on March 17th. That means there will be likely tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people potentially evicted. And they are already the poorest population to begin with. Additionally, we now estimate that there are some 25 to 65,000 cases where people will be subject to eviction that immediately come out of the COVID reality. And what I mean by the COVID reality, these are people who have lost their livelihoods during COVID, with the closing of various businesses, otherwise being furloughed, etc., and have not been covered by things like the CARES Act. They have not been able to get any of the safe harbor funding. So we have this incredibly large population, generally immigrants, many of whom, and let me just, sorry, shut off those horrible cell phones. But so I just want to say that right now what we're facing is, aside from the cases that were already in the housing court, which are predominantly non-payment cases for people who are in poverty and may not be able to get the resources from public services to pay their rent, we have that huge number now that have kicked into gear of people who are subject to eviction, and during a time of pandemic, for God's sakes. And then we have the people who are specifically now subject to losing their housing because they have lost their livelihood due to the pandemic. And again, they are primarily people of color, and they were essential workers who cannot pay their rents. And what is the state doing for them? Well, we in the tenant community have been fighting aggressively to get Albany to essentially kick in with money from Main Street, and not just for Wall Street, for a chance. And that is for people with low-income people who have houses, who can't pay their mortgages, tenants who cannot pay their rents. There's no question that the state should, and there are bills pending which have been given very short shrift to. There are also federal bills by Ro Khanna, people who have endorsed it like Ilhan Omar and Yana Presley, etc., to have essentially a rent forgiveness program, which means what? It just means keeping the tenants housed during the period of pandemic. But of course, it doesn't mean that the landlords are not going to get their rents. It just means that there is special provisions in these bills of rent forgiveness to, unfortunately, pay back the landlords. I wish that the bills were not only took the burden off the tenant, but didn't necessarily pay the landlords. But nevertheless, the landlords would be made whole. So why in hell's name have we not gotten in? What is the political implication of a governor like Cuomo who will not advocate for a bill to prevent the eviction for non-payment during period of pandemic and caused directly by the pandemic of untold numbers, tens of thousands of tenants? But we also have perhaps the largest resistance movement that we have had since the Jesse Gray rent strikes of really the periods of the 50s and 60s, when good parts of Harlem in their entirety were on rent strikes because of the deteriorated housing stock and also the rents being too high. We now have massive rent strikes that are ensuing across the city, a real tenant movement that has come together, that has risked arrest, that have tried to, and successfully, at least for periods, shut down the courts, the housing courts, so that they couldn't recommence the eviction proceedings, and are continuing to try to reshut the courts. And they do have legislation that they proposed that they are trying to get through that will have essentially a rent forgiveness for people who cannot pay it, who have lost their livelihoods and means of paying their rents due to the pandemic. So it's the best of worlds and the worst of worlds, in the sense of people are really mobilizing in a way that has not been seen in decades to form a mass tenant movement to protect people from the evictions, and now not only evictions, but from the health risks that inure when you're homeless as a result of the pandemic, which is, again, in New York on the uptick, along with other places in the country.
I mean, it is unconscionable that the capitalists are allowing people to be evicted in the midst of a pandemic, which will exacerbate the pandemic and kill people, literally kill people who are being evicted. Now, in Austria in 1919, they had a housing problem as well. And the Communist Party, there was a united front of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And they taxed the wealth. They had a wealth tax and built 200,000 public housing homes to put people in. And those housing units still exist. That's public housing. What effort and what do you think the situation is going to be in this catastrophic situation, saying that the property should be expropriated and the wealth, there should be a wealth tax on the many billionaires in New York to pay for housing for working people, the poor people, the people that really need housing in this country and in New York?
Well, there certainly has been a movement, for example, among other things, to deal with a Robin Hood tax. A Robin Hood tax, for example, would tax the stock transfer wealth to like 0.1%, 0.01%, which would bring in enough revenue to be able to completely repopulate, the city, to build housing, affordable, not affordable, but low income, no income, if that is the case, because there are people on fixed incomes, there are people who have no incomes. People have the right to shelter and they have the right to live and be housed. And so there are movements for the Robin Hood tax, and there are growing movements here that talk about absolutely taxing the wealthy. What I'd like to see, though, is not only just a wealth tax, which is still dealing with the private housing market, but with the conceptualization that government has an absolute responsibility. It is a fundamental human right that people have shelter, that government, again, build public housing, and that nobody who resides in that housing is ever charged more than 30% of whatever their income is, whether they're on a fixed income, whether they're on a public assistance income, whether they're on Social Security, disability, etc. So while I absolutely support, and there is a growing movement to tax the rich to be able to get units of housing built, I still think that the more progressive and more significant and inclusive demand of the populace is that shelter is a human right, housing in the public domain, housing should be built for people, and it should be maintained and created by government. And of course, where does government get the money to do that? Well, it certainly can, damn well as we know, and this was an old Communist Party line and so on, and is the money that exists for the Pentagon, the money that exists for war, absolutely is such that it should be repurposed for and shifted to human needs, one of which is housing.
The Democrats, along with Trump, are supporting more money for the military. They're not talking about closing the 800 military bases around the world. They're supporting further militarization of the U.S. government against China, building bases in Asia. It seems like the Democrats actually nationally, Nancy Pelosi here, are for escalated military spending at the same time that we have this massive economic crisis and pandemic, which is forcing people out of their homes, creating millions of unemployed, and the other thing is the fiscal.
Well, it's that, and of course it's foreign intervention and wars with the most backward policies, both the Republicans and the Democrats, to the liberation struggle for a free Palestine. But but we can look to the border. What the Democratic position on the border which is to essentially militarize it and further technologize and militarize it to the tune of untold amounts of money, which is a barbarous, outrageous, terrifying policy as well. So, and it's, of course, it's been a lie that every administration since Reagan has essentially caged children and had these separation policies, and the Democrats have supported separation policies, supported the policies, or did against America, with when there was the tirade against the pink revolution, the communists that were, but it's certainly wresting it back from the control that the corporations essentially have and the money that flows in to maintain the Democratic Party and what has long been a center-right ideology that has governed the Democrats. But of course, for myself, what I'd like to see is most specifically a breaking of the ranks and the creation of a workers' party, a workers' party that joins together with a real rainbow coalition of the quote-unquote civil rights, Black Power movement, and the working class to challenge ultimately the Democratic Party, which certainly has been as much of a corrupting force, although I do not, and I must say, they, at least attitudinally, policy-wise, it's not the advent of fascism, which is what I do believe the Republicans are marching lockstep to fascism.
UAW President Dan Maloney, Rochester Labor Council, has called for a general strike against these attacks, the racist attacks, against the possibility that Trump may decide to oppose a transfer of power if he's not elected. The unions around this whole catastrophic situation of housing, what is the position of the UAW and other unions in New York? I mean, they're likely facing massive layoffs in the midst of this pandemic, the 20, 30,000, 100,000 public workers being laid off, including even yourself, legal aid workers who are funded. It seems like it requires radical action to protect these workers, public workers, city workers, workers all over who are desperately critical to protect people and to defend the health and safety of working people in the cities.
Well, I must say that perhaps aside from the UE, which, like your Rochester chapter, has been singularly good in relating to the issues, for example, of Black Lives Matter, by talking about removal of that essentially the police unions do not belong in the House of Labor and are seeking to remove them, and have otherwise taken progressive stance in conjunction with the upheaval against racist violence, etc. And with perhaps Sarah Nelson from the Flight Attendants Union, who's talked about and started talking about a general strike during the period when there was the shutdown of the government. She was the only one who dared to suggest that, and maybe a contender, I hope, certainly for the spot of Richard Trumka in the AFL-CIO when he retires. Really, the House of Labor has been, at best, quiet, and in many instances a capitulationist. As to New York, the UAW doesn't really have much of an issue now in terms of, even though it should, in terms of the furloughs and proposed layoffs, which are really hitting the public sector unions. So you're talking about AFSCME, essentially. And yes, you could hear a pin drop, but there has been virtually, there wasn't when the federal workers, when the federal government was closed down, And there isn't now as well. And
Isn't that shocking? I mean, with facing massive, massive public layoffs, that none of these national unions representing public workers, AFSCME, the SEIU, the AFT, the CWA, I mean, yes, no united front, no effort to bring together all public workers and say, we're not going to accept this.
We have to put the labor, the movement back in the labor movement. I mean, in a lot of ways, nationally, I'm encouraged by what we saw with the wildcat strikes and other things from teachers' unions around the country. We've had some of the most aggressive and largest wave of strikes that we've had in decades. But as to the bigger unions, such as AFSCME, SEIU, and so on, but for groups like the nurses union, and so on, we have been hard pressed to see labor taking the progressive, not even the progressive, they haven't taken the stance that they should to protect the rights of their workers. And, it makes me cry when, for example, in New York, which has been a struggle that's gone on almost for 3 years now, when I look at what's happening with Spectrum and the cable companies, where the union there has done virtually nothing, the parent union, to protect the workers, all of whom have
union, IBW,
been replaced, and they've been on strike for 3 years now.
And IBW has 30,000 members. It's a powerhouse in New York in the labor movement, the building trades, and yet their own members have been 3 years on strike without any mass mobilization.
And it's not only that, but they've had the power to appeal to the city government, where there are proposals pending to completely disenfranchise. Be damned, you cable companies. Spectrum, you're not getting any of the contracts. You can't exist without the contracts. And oh, by the way, the Spectrum workers that have the workers that have been on strike have also put in to create their own cable company and to vie for the contracts with the city of New York. Hey, New York's a labor town? What in hell's name is wrong? And yes, so that had everything to do with the parent union keeping the pressure on, and then the capitulation of the city government, so that our brothers and sisters have been out on strike for years now. And they do remain on strike. And to see a vile and vicious company like Spectrum union busting completely and thoroughly, and what that portends for the rest of labor, and for, aside from a couple of rallies, where the hell is organized labor been?
But this has been allowed by the unions in New York. New York's a Democratic city. The unions could be raising hell with the Democratic politicians, but apparently they don't want to fight these Democrats to say that the contract should be rejected and they need to break this company.
Yeah.
So
it
seems like the relationship of the Democrats to the unions in this strike that you're talking about is an example of the complete collusion of the unions to the Democratic Party, and the same with housing, that they don't want to fight the Democrats who politically they're aligned with.
Well, I should also say that what we've tried to move for quite some time is the big public sector unions and the unions like SEIU, et cetera, to also take up the issues of their members, which go to issues of housing, which go to issues of healthcare, which go to issues of racial justice, and to see through a racial lens the needs of their membership, and to expand from essentially economist-based unions to really be inclusive of the needs of its membership, which would, I dare say, get the membership more involved and kind of break down this hierarchy of what has been a labor bureaucracy. And I'm sad to say the UAW, as you well know, has had a number of terrifying cases of corruption. And we've lost much of our top leader. But there has to be, in organized labor, obviously a much more aggressive stance. And there has to be a stance in terms of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has counted on the votes of labor. And what has labor gotten back for it? Nothing. nothing. And what it absolutely is outrageous, and this has to percolate up from the membership, a demand that there not be this categorical endorsement with no return of the Democratic apparatchiks, however you might call it, the Democratic leadership. They have taken for granted the votes of labor. Labor leadership has capitulated to that. And largely, the structures are so undemocratized that the involvement of the rank and file is nominal. Aside from, various, there may be shops, there may be particular locals. So New York right now, in terms of any really meaningful fight back against proposed layoffs, which, as I said, are mostly public sector workers, is, yes, you can hear a pin drop.
Okay, I want to thank you, Mimi, for joining.
And by the way, those public sector workers are the last hired. They are going to be the first fired. They are the very people that we're talking about that are most in jeopardy of winding up in the homeless population.
And those are black.
Hey, union leaders, get the hell on the ball, push these damn Democrats, and put the movement back in the labor movement.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining us on WorkWeek, Mimi. We've had a wide-ranging discussion of the whole housing crisis, and actually, I think there needs to be more of that nationally on what working people face. The homeless, oppressed, poor people in the midst of this pandemic. It is criminal that potentially millions of people could be homeless in the next 6 months because of the economic crisis and failure of the government to provide for people. So thanks for joining us.
There's a projection of 40 million people that could wind up homeless. So yes, and I thank you for your stellar work, both as a labor activist and as somebody who brings the voice of the working people to our populace and tells it like it is.